Now a 10 News Special Edition. Your voice, your vote.
Well, thank you for joining us for this special debate on the issues surrounding Proposition 64, marijuana legalization here in California. This forum is presented by 10 News and our media partner 600 Kogo News Radio. I'm Steve Atkinson. Let's begin with a closer look at Proposition 64.
For adults 21 and older to possess up to an ounce of marijuana and imposes taxes on the cultivation and sale of pot. Potentially, those taxes could bring in $1 billion in revenue. Supporters say Prop 64 could end the drug war and safely regulate the widely used drug. But opponents warn an increase of marijuana use for kids and a surge in traffic fatalities.
And with me today to discuss the issue are Anthony Betancourt, an attorney specializing in medical marijuana who supports Prop 64, and Steve Walter, president and the Deputy District Attorneys Association, who opposes Prop 64. So let's begin with a brief overview from both of you. First of all, Anthony, why vote on Prop 65? Why vote yes?
Well, I think we should start with the proposition that people should not be incarcerated for marijuana use, nor should people who are involved in the marijuana supply chain be incarcerated. If we advance from there, the next question is, well, then if we no longer incarcerate these people, what do we do with the product that is now available? And the answer is that we should regulate its sales, we should test it, and we should tax it. And that's what Proposition 64 does. Essentially, it largely decriminalizes existing state-level marijuana penalties, and then it also sets up this dual state licensing infrastructure for regulated sales.
All right. Steve, why vote against it?
Well, a number of things. I think first of all what it does is it's all about big marijuana. It's setting itself up to turn marijuana into the next big tobacco. It also tends to normalize marijuana use, which I think is going to be a detriment to young adults as well as teens. Currently, marijuana is most popular amongst the late teens and early 20-somethings. I think studies have shown that marijuana use at that age does have a tremendous effect on the development of the brain, and for us to normalize that and make it more accessible, or make it more, I guess, accepted, you're going to wind up with a serious public health problem.
You hit on a lot of topics we're going to discuss here today. First of all, Prop 64 is a long initiative. It's 62 pages long. Steve hit on this. There's a lot of regulations in there, Anthony. A lot of people think this is setting up for big business, big tobacco to come in and take over for our small farmers. How do you answer that?
Not necessarily. So in the long run, that may be something that pans out. However, in the short term, there are plenty of other limitations in place. Specifically, marijuana is still a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, a federal law. For that reason, people who are involved in the marijuana industry don't have access to bank accounts. They can't get a loan from the bank, and it's really difficult for money to flow in and out. For that reason, you're not going to see any large-scale tobacco growers or companies that are involved in tobacco come in and risk the penalties for violating federal law by coming into California.
Steve, how do you answer that?
I disagree. I think right now you're already seeing in Riverside County some of the communities up there that are developing these large plots with an eye towards legalization if it does pass, to make these large investments in marijuana. I recognize that the way the regulations or the statute is right now, or the proposition, it's 5 years before you can see these large mega growers start online. But it's certainly there, it's going to come to pass, and I don't think it's a good thing.
As a member of answering for, I guess, law enforcement here, if Prop 64 passes, 15% there's going to be an excise tax, there's going to be state taxes, there could be local taxes, some people say as high as 30% across the board when all is said and done. Would that create an underground market if it gets too expensive?
Absolutely. I mean, earlier this summer, a group of us from San Diego law enforcement went to Denver to study the problem, or the effects, I guess, of their legalization, which was done back in 2013. The black market there has grown astronomically because of the legalization. You have a lot of people coming in under the guise of legal marijuana and growing and then shipping it out of state. They're also diverting it from what they call home grows, which are legal under their law, which you could possibly see here. That's also being diverted into the legal market. What you're seeing, though, is law enforcement in Colorado. The city of Denver spends more time since the legalization of marijuana dealing with marijuana-related crimes than they ever have in the past.
You've seen what's happened in both Colorado and Washington. How do you answer that with a possible black market coming out of this?
Yeah, so could there be a black market? Well, there currently is a black market.
Yeah.
There currently is a black market in California, and looking forward, if Proposition 64 does not pass, then what will happen is come January 1st, 2018, the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safeties Act, which is already law, will kick into effect, and there will be a medical regulated market. The penalty then for being outside of the regulated market is felonies. You no longer have protection against state-level felonies. Under Prop 64, however, the penalty is civil penalties. So there's still some mechanism to quash unlicensed sales, but the question is, should we punish them civilly by way of financial penalties or criminally and incarcerate people?
All right, you talked about medical marijuana. That's a big issue here in California. With all those taxes we just talked about, there are 800,000 card-carrying medical marijuana holders here in California. Some of those, you could say, don't deserve the card, but there are a lot of people who really do need it for medicinal purposes. Anthony, can those people be taxed out of what they need for medicine?
So likely not. The way that the Prop 64 works is that it will tax recreational sales. It will keep separate medical cannabis regulation safety sales, so medical sales. So medical sales will still go forward without built-in additional taxes, as opposed to the recreational sales, which have the 15% excise tax and certain taxes to cultivators, as well as local governmental taxes.
Why is there such a fear then, Steve, with the medical marijuana community?
I think that, I haven't spoken to the medical marijuana community, but what I have seen, I think it's big tobacco. They're concerned that they're going to be priced out of the market, that they're going to be, the mom and pop growers are no longer going to exist, and it's all going to be about big business.
One question for you here. Lynn Lyman, the California State Director for Drug Policy Alliance, told Rolling Stone magazine, quote, "We see California as the tipping point to end federal prohibition. Colorado has begun to undermine the Mexican cartels, but I think legalization here in California might cut their legs out from under them." From your position, Steve, has our war on drugs failed? Is this what needs to happen for California to kind of be the push to get the entire nation going on this?
I disagree. I see there being a larger black market if Prop 64 was to pass. The fact that to say that Colorado is no longer experiencing that is inaccurate. I do see the black market growing. It's not taxed. Why would someone want to pay all those taxes when you can buy it off the street corner and get just as good a product as you would at a dispensary or a retail establishment? That doesn't make sense. It would wind up pricing, the taxes could divert people to the black market because it's going to be less expensive.
She's talking about ending the war on drugs. Is that being overly optimistic, Anthony?
Possibly. The concern here is, should we criminalize marijuana use, I think. And let's focus exactly on marijuana because that's what Prop 64 does. Prop 64 will largely decrease the war on marijuana, but it will still exist. There are still state-level felonies for marijuana. If you sell to a minor, it's still a felony. If you're doing in-home butane manufacturing, that's still a felony. And those crimes should still be prosecuted at the felony level. So marijuana crimes will still exist. They're just largely pushed down. Most are moved from felonies to misdemeanors. And then there's a regulated system for taxing and for product testing, which is really important to the end-level consumer.
Yes or no from me, both of you here. If California passes this, does the rest of the nation follow? Anthony?
Likely, but over a long period of time.
Interesting. Steve?
Hard to say. I mean, I think you'll need to see the feds get involved in potentially descheduling or lowering the schedule of marijuana for that to happen.
Yeah, no doubt here. All right, despite the passage of medical marijuana that we had here 20 years ago, there are still numerous arrests for felony possession. There were 8,000 last year, 13,000 the year before that. Most of these are young African American and Latino men. So Steve, wouldn't you say this is time for at least some sort of change?
I question the statistic that it's all Latinos.
These are California statistics.
Based on what?
Based on California state statistics that have come out.
Okay, but I mean, I'm wondering where they've come from. I don't know that that's necessarily the trend. I mean, I've been prosecuting narcotic crimes for a number of years, and I don't necessarily agree that all the defendants or the people that we're prosecuting necessarily are represented as mostly African American and Latino.
So what about some sort of change?
Well, I don't know that legalizing it is the thing to do. I just have a problem legalizing marijuana or decriminalizing it, because there are a number of things that, as I've said, you're going to continue to see a black market, and if you end up decriminalizing it, you're taking away drastically the tools that we use to prosecute and deal with marijuana issues. They're going to be misdemeanors. It's going to be very difficult to deal with the black market.
Anthony, your answer to that same question.
So current law is largely discretionary. There's the discretion on the officer as to whether they arrest. There's the discretion to the prosecutor as to whether they file. And then once when the person's actually incarcerated and they have charges filed against them, usually if they're poorer or of less means, they can't post bail. So they're already in custody. So now they have an incentive to plead early just to get out of custody. Furthermore, attorneys are expensive, and not everyone can afford it. And that disproportionately affects people who may otherwise have a defense but can't afford an attorney. And more often than not, those are communities of color, minority communities, and communities with lower SES.
I'm interested to know, Steve, because most people say, who are in support of Prop 64, would say that this will help out law enforcement. I've heard arguments on both sides. What's your opinion about that?
I don't think it will at all. I mean, you're going to see a larger effort dealing with the black market. Just looking at the Colorado experience, as I said, Denver police have seen their having to deal with marijuana-related crimes, the black market. It's gone up incrementally. I mean, it's huge. It's much bigger than it ever was before the legalization of marijuana.
There are some law enforcement agencies that are pushing for this. Anthony, why?
Well, law enforcement enforces the law, and we live in a republic, so we get to choose what the law should be. The question is a person who cultivates marijuana in an amount that exceeds their recommendation, or even if they just do it recreationally, should they be incarcerated for up to 3 years? Current law says yes. Under Prop 64, they could be incarcerated at the most up to 1 year.
Both of you know about what's happened in the last 3-4 years with this happening in Colorado and Washington alone. There have been some statistics that do show that if Prop 64 passes here, there will be an increase in marijuana-related traffic fatalities. Anthony, how do you answer those fears?
Well, that's a legitimate concern. But right now, people are still driving under the influence, whether Prop 64 is passed or not. Driving under the influence is a serious crime. People should not do so. I think what you're going to see in the future is that problem is going to slowly solve itself as new technology comes into play in the marketplace. Over the past 5 years, we've seen the advent of Uber, of Lyft becoming more and more popular. Hopefully with self-driving cars on the horizon and the proliferation of services such as Uber and Rent, those numbers will decrease naturally.
That's a long way away, and asking people to be very disciplined, though, isn't it, Steve?
It is. I think, again, the Colorado experience since legalization in 2013, they've seen marijuana-related traffic fatalities go up over 60%. I don't think that that's a good thing. I mean, from a public policy, a public health perspective, it's not a good thing.
Is it marijuana related? That could be marijuana THCs in the system, but it still could be heavily influenced by alcohol or opiates in some way. Isn't that true too?
Certainly possible, yes.
Anthony?
Absolutely. So when you test the bloodstream for marijuana, what you're testing is for a certain cannabinoid that exists for having marijuana use. It does not mean that you were currently intoxicated or under the influence of marijuana. It just means that you had used marijuana at some point within probably the past 30 days. So when we're looking at traffic fatalities, especially in states that are recreational, what it really means is that those people who were in traffic fatalities had used marijuana. It does not mean that they had a collision because of marijuana.
With that in mind, Steve, as we move forward, and the polls show that this does have a good chance of passing, how far away, or what do we need to do with law enforcement to teach them to know signs that someone may be under the influence of marijuana?
Well, what you need to be able to do is have correlation studies that would show, you know, if you have a certain THC level in your bloodstream, what does that mean in terms of your ability to function? Right now, you don't have any of that. There's no way to really tell if somebody is at whatever the percentages of THC, whether they're impaired or not. So that's something we'd like to see. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have a per se sort of law. So if you reach, you know, some specific level of THC concentration, you are by law determined to be under the influence.
A lot of time, a lot of training, though.
Right.
According to the Centers for Disease Control, traffic-related deaths caused by prescription drugs, caused by alcohol, far outweigh that of marijuana. Are we not being hypocritical, Steve? by focusing so heavily on marijuana in this particular case?
Well, I guess the question should really be, do we want to go there? Why do we want to go there? Why do we want to subject or make marijuana more available such that people are able to use it and then drive, or use it and then become addicted to it? The fact that it's out there and it's more acceptable and more available, I think that's a bad thing. I mean, we've already learned from tobacco and alcohol that having that available for use does have problems as far as public health, and I see the same thing here.
Anthony, how would you answer mothers and fathers with young kids who, are being influenced by this, and now you're just adding something else on the table other than prescription drugs, opiates, or alcohol now?
Well, I would say that marijuana is already out there. And if you're looking at who's more likely to sell marijuana to a minor, someone in the black market or someone who has a license that costs them in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think the answer is pretty clear that they're more likely to be sold in the black market as opposed to a regulated market.
All right, with that in mind, if Prop 64 passes, of course, we all think that the stigma on marijuana would decline as well. It would become more popular with kids. I know that there have been studies in Colorado, but there was a great fear in Colorado. Yet a study recently showed, Steve, that use among youth is actually flat.
I disagree with that. Rocky Mountain HIDA, which is an arm of the office or the President's Office of Drug Control Policy, recently in September released a study showing that Colorado ranks #1 in the United States in both youth as well as adult use of marijuana.
Anthony?
So as to adult use, I mean, yeah, it's a recreational state, so that would make sense. As to youth use, I'm not sure about that, but I would point to people's experiences traveling abroad. If you travel to Europe, which is a country which has more normalized relations with drinking at a younger age, you'll see that the effects of alcoholism are significantly lower there. And that's because you're raised around it. You see it growing up. You learn not to abuse it. It's important for a family to be personally responsible and to have open discussions with their children. And I think that's the best way to approach it.
All right, let's talk about edibles. Because while it may not seem like a huge issue, let's say someone 21 or older does purchase something like this at a dispensary and brings it home. I think we have some pictures we can show. Steve, what's your greatest concern about edibles and that being available for a toddler, a child, anything like that walking into a home?
Well, it's currently, edibles typically look like substances, snacks that you'd see, gummy bears, candy bars, brownies, cookies. They are packaged and made to look like that. So I see them, I'm not saying that children are going to go out and buy them, but let's say a brother, an adult brother, a parent brings it home and leaves it out, and a child were to see it, they're certainly going to be attracted to it, as you can see in the graphic there on the screen.
Many look very similar.
Exactly. I see that being a problem. Colorado has seen edibles. They're basically, when they're dealing with marijuana, probably 50% of the cases, it is edibles.
Anthony, 62 pages of legislation. Is there anything that can prevent some of this, certain things from being sold or not being sold?
Absolutely. So Prop 64 has certain labeling requirements, tamper-proof packaging requirements, and then it also has dosage requirements, which I think is the most important thing. Currently, if you buy an edible on the black market, you likely have no idea what dosage you're receiving. Likewise, if you buy it under the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safeties Act in the future, it will be labeled, but the dosages will vary. One will be 150 milligrams, the other could be 5, the other could be 10. Prop 64 imposes standardized dosing, 10 milligram segments. If it's one candy bar, it'll have to be broken up into individual pieces that can be ripped off into 10 milligram segments. By having a standardized requirement, I think you're going to see a lot more familiarity with how edibles will affect an individual.
Again, a lot of this comes down to adult responsibility at home if there are children in the home as well.
Well, again, just look at alcohol. Is anybody going to disagree that if you're 18, 19 years old, your parents are out of town, you're not going to be able to find a keg, you're not going to be able to have a tremendous party? It's the same thing.
Yeah. The health effects, we don't fully understand them yet. There are studies that are being done now that this is legal in Colorado and Alaska and in Oregon as well, Washington. But we don't fully know the health effects, especially when we're talking about young brains developing. So Anthony, I wanted to ask you this. Are we kind of rushing into this without knowing all the scientific information that we need?
No, we're not. Vice News just recently reported on some papers received from the Department of Health. They received via a Freedom of Information Act request. And what it showed, I'm sorry, it was the Food and Drug Administration. What they showed is they showed that there's no correlation between certain mental disabilities and marijuana use at early ages. There has historically been a concern between schizophrenia being triggered, or people predisposed to schizophrenia being triggered by early marijuana use, and the FDA study shows there's not. Furthermore, Prop 64 allocates money toward the University of California system to research these issues, and it also allocates money specifically toward UC San Diego to research these issues as well.
Much of Prop 64, the revenue is going to go towards regulation and education, but is that kind of, moving forward with something and all the studies come later, Steve?
Here's the thing I have about all this tax revenue that is, in my opinion, very pie in the sky. You have a very basically all of the money that is raised through taxes in a legal marijuana market or a legal marijuana rubric, it all goes into the marijuana tax fund. That is supposed to sustain this huge bureaucracy that we're going to create to oversee it, enforce it. There's 7 different current state agencies that are involved in the enforcement of this. That money, first of all, is going to fund all of that bureaucratic effort. If there's any left over, then $10 million of it is going to UC system. After that, if there's money left over, you have a certain component going to CHP to do a study on whether, what the effects of drug driving, marijuana driving, and so forth. You don't get down to the community-based reinvestment until you have basically paid for the regulation, given $10 million to the University of San Diego system, another $10 million to CHP, $2 million to the Center for Medical Cannabis Research. And if there's anything left over after that, then it goes into 60% youth, dealing with youth programs to prevent them from that. 20% after that goes to law enforcement, and another 20% goes to community studies.
I think it's important to let our audience know, Anthony, that the revenue off of these taxes could be $1 billion by 2018, but a lot of people are confused. They think a lot of this is going towards infrastructure, schools, things for our kids. It's not.
Correct. It goes to a special fund, which is for primarily to run the bureaucracy. That's the first thing.
Right.
And that's important because we're talking about a bureaucratic shift. We're talking about, are we going to treat people through incarceration and criminalization, or through regulation and treatment? After the bureaucracy is paid for, what happens, as stated previously, is it then goes to schools. It then goes back into the community for anti-drug education. It goes towards CHP for help with enforcement of DUIs. Then it goes back into other programs, which is how we should be structuring our society to deal with these issues.
I was recently in Colorado doing a series of stories on the Amendment 64, our Prop 64 here. One of the things we found was something called green tourism. People coming to Colorado to be able to smoke marijuana in a legal society. That's good for them as far as tourism is concerned, but we also found it helped to raise housing prices there. Anthony, we are in a market right now where affordability is already limited here in San Diego. People are charging from $2,000 a month, it's jumping to $4,000. Are we getting into a huge issue with our housing here?
So not so likely in San Diego, but this would be an issue in the more rural Northern California areas where people are doing land buys, hoping to get a license to cultivate.
Right.
If you're asking whether that's good or bad, I think that's in the eye of the landholder, because it could be really good if you own land up there.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Steve? What do you think about this?
I agree with you. I see prices going up. The experience in Denver is, commercial space, right. Rents are going way up. You talked though about the green tourism. When you were there, did you happen to go to the 16th Street Mall and see all the homeless and the people that were attracted there?
We did notice that they had to put a police officer on every corner, which goes into taxpayer funds, paid for by taxpayers as well. Right. They've cleaned it up, but it cost them money to do it. Yes. Yeah, so that's an issue that we might, there's ancillary issues that always come around. Marijuana is an all-cash industry. I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Steve. Should we be concerned, because the banks won't work with them, should we be concerned about a rise in robberies here?
You already see it. I mean, you have all the medical marijuana dispensaries that are being robbed. I think there was one that happened over the weekend. I believe I read about it over in the Sunday paper.
Right.
So you're seeing it now. I don't see any reason that it would not continue.
How can we control that, Anthony?
Well, what we would need to do is we would need either direction from the Treasury Department or from the federal government. And you can't access banking systems because of the Schedule 1 designation. Hopefully the Treasury Department steps up and starts giving us some good regulations.
Steve, interesting for you, opponents have raised less than $300,000 for no on 64. In the meantime, supporters have raised over $12 million to pass this initiative. Are you fighting a battle you can't win?
I don't know. I saw a poll last week where the pro 64 was 52, 53%. This close to the election, I don't know that that necessarily bodes well for passage.
It is very close. Anthony, your thoughts on the money that's been raised and put into this?
Well, it looks like this is going to pass. I know polls back in August have gone as high as 71% passage, which is just ridiculous. I think ultimately people are...
Ridiculous as in you thought that was too high?
That is a very, very high number for any ballot measure at all.
And it's come down quite a bit since.
It has come down quite a bit. I think it's kind of sitting around 58 to 60%, some studies as low as 52. It looks like it's going to pass. The next question is, what are local governments going to do as far as land use ordinances?
That's the biggest question to come. What will local agencies do? 1 minute for final thoughts. Steve, we'll start with you on this.
I think one of the biggest concerns that I have is there's this large bureaucracy that's going to be created. If this passes, it's going to be effective the very next day. The regulations to get some of these licenses that you need to operate in that arena aren't even going to come into play until January of 2018. So what are we going to do for the roughly 14 months from the day it passes until these regulations kick in? One of the descriptions that I got in Denver over and over again, when they saw it pass, they weren't equipped regulatorily to deal with it. It was described as building a fire engine on the way to the fire, and I see that as being a problem. So you're going to have a Wild West out there for probably 14 months. If we're going to do this, why can't we do it right? Why can't we get everything in place and then look to legalize it?
And I think Washington did wait a little bit longer than Colorado to try and get it right. Anthony, how about you? Final thoughts?
Well, I think the ultimate question is, how do we want to treat marijuana in our society? Is it something that we should criminalize people for, or is it something that we should make sure is safe and that we should offer support for people who are having problems with it? Prop 64 chooses the latter. Which is why when I say that we should vote for Prop 64, I'm standing alongside the California Democratic Party and the ACLU in approving this ballot measure.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The enlightenment on this. We want to thank our guests, Anthony Betancourt and Steve Walter. Thank you as well for joining us. A reminder that 10 News is your complete source for election news and resources. You can find much more on Prop 64. Just go to our website, 10news.com, under the Spotlight section, and click on Your Voice, Your Vote. You can also find quick links to register to vote. You can vote by mail and find your polling place there. And join 10 News at ABC News on election night for complete live coverage.